The following interview was recorded in week 7 of COVID-19 lockdown, shortly after the publication of an article in the Sunday Telegraph. It was written by Tom Holland, award-winning historian, biographer, and author of Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, a book about the impact of Christianity on Western culture. In his Sunday Telegraph article, Tom Holland lamented the fact that many church leaders, in his view, are sounding more like, quote, middle managers at this time than, quote, speaking with the voice of prophecy, explaining to a grieving and anxious people how the dead will rise into the blaze of eternal life. He kindly agreed to an interview to explain his reasons for writing the article.
Well, I've just written a history of Christianity that in effect is a history of Christianity's influence on the world, and more specifically the West. And the thesis of the book is that Christianity has been so utterly influential that in effect everybody in the West are goldfish, and the waters that we swim in are Christian, and so we are not aware of that. And in a way, that's a measure of Christianity's triumph. I mean, I think it is the most revolutionary, the most transformational, the most influential way of explaining humanity's purpose that humanity has ever devised. But I think that in a country like Britain that's been Christian for so many centuries, there is a problem, which is that most people have come to have absorbed Christian teaching so thoroughly that they no longer recognize them as Christian. And so the risk, therefore, for the church is that unless they frame these teachings in overtly prophetic, biblical, theologically nuanced ways, they will simply sound like they are issuing kind of public service broadcasts.
Why do you think it's taken a historian to make this kind of prophetic call to the church? That seems a bit odd.
Well, I'm sure that that lots of priests are probably feeling something similar. But I was asked to write this article. Did I? The pitch was: did I think that that this experience of pandemic was going to help the church? And initially, when it hit, I thought that it would. And one of the reasons for that was the incredible power of the appearance of the Pope in an empty St. Peter's Square. And the sight of the Pope alone in this vast space with the wail of sirens in the background and the clanging of bells across the cityscape was incredibly powerful to me, and enhanced by the fact that the Pope stood before an icon of the Virgin that had been sent to Rome in the pontificate of Gregory the Great. And Gregory the Great had become Pope at a time of plague. And I'd written about this in Dominion, my book. And Gregory himself was the author of a commentary on the book of Job, which in turn, of course, is in a way the most demanding book in the Bible in terms of explaining the issues that we all face now. Why would a loving, all-powerful God allow this to happen? And these are incredibly challenging questions that nevertheless the church has never shrunk from answering. And there is this incredible history going back through the millennia, even before Christianity, back to the age of the Hebrew prophets. And this legacy is what the church, this is what the church should, I think, be all about. It's an enormous reservoir that is there to help people understand what's going on. I mean, I want to hear great preachers, bishops, theologians engage with these questions, and not just in terms of sermons or academic analysis or whatever, in the kind of the visual statement that the Pope made that day. And I guess maybe they're going on out there, but if they are, then I haven't seen them, and that may be my problem. But I feel that I'm getting the language of bureaucrats rather than the kind of of language that Gregory the Great was speaking in plague-ravaged Rome.
Now, you've talked a lot about the uniqueness, the singularity of certain aspects of the Christian faith, the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and so on. Even the kind of elements that our culture finds weird. What do you think are the key weird elements that the church should be trumpeting at this time?
Well, the weirdness of Christianity in the context of the world that it emerges into, basically, we no longer recognize it as being weird. So two obvious things are the idea that all human beings are created in the image of God, which derives from Genesis, and then the refinement that Paul gives it, the idea that there is no Jew or Greek, there is no man or woman, there is no slave or free, that every human being has a kind of inherent dignity. So that's odd by the standards of the classical world. And then, of course, there's the idea that's embodied in the cross itself, the idea that that defeat can be victory, that humiliation can be triumph, that the person who suffers can triumph over the person who is torturing him. And these are ideas that people in contemporary British society have internalized so profoundly that they just assume that it's human nature. Now, I think that, again, to reiterate, the risk for the church is that they present these teachings as though they are just kind of liberal pabulum. This is the kind of stuff that everybody accepts. So we'll just, which then blurs the distinctiveness of church teaching into a kind of a blur of voices that that it loses its distinction. I think there's no point in the church making broadcasting these messages at a time where basically everyone accepts them, unless they are reminding us what the roots of these messages are. And these roots lie in history, but they also lie in a particular theology.
Say a little bit more, if you would, about the kind of depth charge that the cross represented in the ancient world.
Well, to the Romans, a cross is a symbol of their power. Everyone remembers Spartacus and Crassus lining the Appian Way with a great row of crosses and putting slaves up on them. And those slaves served the Romans as kind of billboards. They were adverts broadcasting the power of Rome and its absolute right to torture to death anyone who opposed them, and particularly slaves. And crucifixion was viewed as the fate par excellence of a slave, because it was not only physically agonizing, but it was public and therefore humiliating. And humiliation is kind of almost a fate worse than death in antiquity, so that people can see as your eyes are pecked out by birds, as your genitals get attacked, as you heave your body up and down. All those agonies are visible. And that's the point of a cross. It's public. Now, Christianity totally upends that. Christianity makes of the cross a triumph, a symbol of the triumph of the slave over the master, a symbol of the triumph of the oppressed over the oppressor. And it's that makes it, in a way, the most remarkable symbol in the whole field of human culture. But again, we've become kind of desensitized to it. We don't think about what it represents.
You sound almost more like a priest than a historian at times.
Well, I don't know whether to be flattered or insulted by that. I think that it is impossible to understand Christianity as a historical phenomenon unless you understand why it's been so successful. I mean, that's kind of that's self-evident, and you can't understand why it's successful unless you kind of allow yourself to have some sense of the blaze of revelation that it constituted for those who first preached it and those who have believed in it over the course of the centuries and the millennia that have followed.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I mean, as you've studied history and as you've studied the roots of Christianity, have you felt that there is some intrinsic power to it that goes beyond the merely ideological or rational What have you kind of sensed as you've worked with source materials and looked at the whole scope of things?
Well, I basically I have two faces on this. I have to look two ways. On the one hand, as I say, I have to open myself up to what is remarkable, what is transformative about this remarkable kind of cultural revolution. And I have to allow myself to share in the sense of vision that may be felt by a church father in the 3rd century, or a noblewoman in the 13th century, or a Puritan in the 16th century. All of these kind of modulations of Christian belief, I have to respond to and kind of let them send kind of chords echoing through me. At the same time, I have to be objective as to the degree that I can be, and I have to preserve a sense of perspective, and I have to treat what I'm writing about actually not for what it may or may not reveal about the nature of the divine, even whether the divine exists, but simply as a phenomenon of human culture. But ultimately, I think that those two can be integrated, because what is evident, and whether you interpret this as being the expression of kind of divine favor or an expression of kind of cultural Darwinism, what is evident is that the Christian message touches something very, very profound within humans that I think until the coming of Christianity, humans had not realized was there to be touched. And that's what's so fascinating about it from the historian's point of view. Now, whether you can extrapolate from that kind of a theological perspective is not for me to say.
I'd love to know, as a historian, as we come up to the day of Pentecost in the church calendar, when you read the book of Acts and you look at the kind of shock waves that produced the early church and its kind of impact through the ancient world, what do you make of what happened on the day of Pentecost, this claim that the third person of the Godhead comes and fills believers?
Well, it's very interesting because those early books of Acts have a seismic influence on the development of the West and therefore of the entire world. One of the ways is the way in which the early church practices a kind of form of communism. Everything is shared in common, and you get this appearing again and again. So with the Hussites in 15th century Bohemia, with the diggers in 17th century England. And then I think clearly through into the French Revolution, into the Russian Revolution. I mean, its influence on Marxism is absolutely profound. I mean, Marxism is basically a riff on that passage in Acts. So that's one aspect. The other, absolutely, as you point out, is this idea of the Spirit coming down and illuming the heart. And that, of course, ties in with the Pauline idea that the law of God is written on the heart. And this, again, is kind of fundamentally crucial to the way that Christian, as opposed, say, to Islamic or Jewish civilization, has evolved. Because both for Jews and Muslims, the idea that law is something that God has personally delivered, that it's there, it's written out. Whereas for Christians, the idea is that law is something that you know, and therefore, if the Spirit informs your understanding of the law, of what God wants, then that will be refined and become better over time. So the idea of kind of moral progress, the idea that law exists to improve year on, is a fundamentally Christian one, bred of this idea. And it manifests itself, again, in all kinds of distinctive ways. So it manifests itself in the invention of the idea in the 12th and 13th centuries, thanks to the canon lawyers, of the notion of human rights, the idea that humans have rights to certain things. Again, a transformative notion. And then again in the 17th and 18th century, it animates a kind of distinctively Protestant understanding that just because, say, a classic example, just because in Scripture it never says that slavery as an institution should be abolished, that doesn't mean that the message is not there in Scripture, because the Spirit can come and can illumine the reader and enable him or her to understand that actually slavery must be abolished. And again, that kind of great blaze of fire that ends up consuming the entire institution of Christianity in incredible pace. I think we're entirely entitled to think of that as a kind of Pentecostal flame. And it's a Pentecostal flame that continues to burn now, because I didn't really touch on this in Dominion, but it's very evident that the two great kind of understandings of God that are serving to transform the world at the moment. One, Islamic radicalism. Radical Islam is in all the headlines. I mean, very, very kind of in your face. But the other one, kind of Pentecostalism, the idea that the Spirit has descended and is looming, that's kind of under the radar, but is equally having a transformative effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's having an amazing effect in the global south, isn't it? I mean, we don't necessarily see it, but I've read about it. We've heard stories about it. As one travels, you begin to touch it. It's huge, the Pentecostal movement.
Yes, and I think more than just simply Pentecostalism, the idea that the Spirit is moving is something, for instance, that's animated the incredible rate of conversion in Africa, which as a historical phenomenon is on a par with the conversion of Europe in the first millennium. I mean, it's a kind of amazing rapidity. And the idea that the Spirit is manifest is incredibly important to that.
Just stepping back to your article again and thinking about secular society at the moment and how it responds to Christianity. Some people have said that secular society wants the kingdom, wants the fruits of the gospel without the king, or they want the fruits of the gospel, but they don't want the tree, if you like, that it springs from. How do you think secular society has been so successful in managing to take certain aspects of Christianity, concerned with, the dignity of all people and so on, but has turned away from the person of Jesus?
Because the idea of the secular is a fundamentally Christian one. It's bred of Christian history and Christian theology, and I mean, ultimately it goes back to the story in the Gospels of Jesus being shown, asked, should we pay taxes, and asking for the coin and saying, whose head is that? And it's Caesar's. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's, which establishes an idea that there are two dimensions, which then gets kind of theologized by Augustine in the wake of the sack of Rome. And Augustine says that Rome is the Roman Empire is like a kind of, the life of an individual human being. It's born on the flux of what he calls the cyclum, and the cyclum is the limit of human memory. It's essentially the idea that everything that is earthly is born, lives, dies, and is swept away into oblivion, unless humans can grasp onto the kind of life raft, which Augustine defines as religio, which is the kind of the bond, literally the bond that joins heaven to earth. So this idea of there being a dimension of the cyclum and a dimension of religio, over the course of the Middle Ages, this becomes politicized. It's what leads to something that is really distinctive to Western Latin civilization. The idea that there are twin dimensions, a secular dimension, and then the dimension of religio. And with the Protestant Reformation, the notion of religio, which in the Middle Ages, religio referred to those who were kind of specialists, so monks, nuns, whatever. Everyone in Protestantism has a religio. It becomes something personal, it becomes something private, and the effect of that is to kind of shunt the concept of what comes to be anglicized as religion onto the margins. And even very devout Protestants in the 18th and 19th centuries are happy to accept that there is a space called the secular, which is seen as being neutral, and then there are things called religions. And Christianity, having defined itself as a religion, then basically characterizes what people in India believe in as something called Hinduism. They construct religions modeled on Christianity that they call Judaism and Islam. And this whole idea that there is something called the secular and there are things called religions this is the water that we swim in. This is what I mean by being in a goldfish bowl. We don't even realize how culturally contingent the word religion and the word secular is. And that's why, in a way, that the triumph of secularism is a kind of logical endpoint for trends within the evolution of specifically Latin Christianity. Which is why I think it's entirely legitimate to describe humanism as a kind of, a godless Protestant sect, if you like. I think that the danger for the Church of England is that it doesn't become the same thing.
So do you think that in the secular West that the church has any hope of regaining the kind of traction that the early church had? Is that possible? Or do you think the church is a dwindling institution?
Well, I think that there are two possibilities, and the first is that, if you like, institutional Christianity was the equivalent of a kind of rocket blaster to get what we might call humanism or secularism through the atmosphere. And having blasted its way through the atmosphere, it can get rid of the rocket boosters, just drop it off, and humanism drifts through space, sustained by its own ideology, sustained by its own assumptions. It doesn't need the rocket fuel that Christianity and Christian theology and Christian belief and Christian mythology had provided it with. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that doesn't turn out to be the case, and that things that liberals have taken for granted turn out not to be quite as fundamental to human nature as they'd assumed. And I think that we can see that in the context of the growing tensions within Western societies, the sense that the kind of liberals who dominate politics, media, academia, all kinds of things, the palpable sense that they feel that they're not entirely getting their own way at the moment. And also, perhaps more significantly, the sense that we understand the world in liberal terms, and we assume that everything that is liberal is therefore universal. Again, very like Christians do. But I think the rise of ancient civilizations back to power like China, like India, remind us of the fact that actually a lot of what liberals might assume are universal, assume a human nature, are not at all, that they're bred of very specific cultural seedbed. And if people come to recognize that, then I think that they will look back to that seedbed and say, well, actually, I think we need to water the roots here, because if we don't have the roots, then the blooms are all going to fade and die. And I say that because basically that's where I am. I mean, that's where I've come to. I was kind of cheerful tub thumper for the Enlightenment, the belief that everything came from Greece or Voltaire or whatever. I no longer think that. I feel that pretty much everything that I take for granted is Christian. And so, you asked me why I sound like a preacher. Well, maybe it's because it seems important to me that we acknowledge where this has come from and acknowledge the power of these assumptions as myths. And by myth, not in a negative sense, a myth in the sense that Tolkien or C.S. Lewis used it, that these are ways of understanding the world that kind of transcend reality.
Absolutely, because Tolkien says a myth can be true, doesn't he? And so to what extent does this hinge on whether this revelation of God in human history is what happened, that there is some kind of transcendent truth that took place, rather than Christianity being a series of sort of rather brilliantly packaged cultural, ethical values?
Well, I think that's the huge issue for society and for the church. And I think obviously the role of the church is to say that it matters profoundly, and that in a way, not in a way. I mean, if you're a Christian, it's the single most important thing that's ever happened, and it's the pivot on which everything turns. And you can't just kind of moderately think that. If that's what you think, then you've got to really scream it from the rooftops. And I guess in a way, that going back to the article, that's what I was saying. I guess I don't feel that the strangeness of this, and therefore the importance of it, is something that I'm hearing necessarily from church leaders, I guess.
After all your historical studies, after all of your reflection, who is the person of Jesus Christ to you, Tom Holland?
That's a very difficult question, because it immediately requires me to put the figure of Jesus in a historical context. And one of the great joys of writing Dominion as a history not of Christianity, but of Christianity's influence, is that I didn't have to enter the bog of who the historical Jesus actually is, because I'm aware that it requires a lifetime of study even to vaguely be qualified to talk about that. I guess that what I would say, however, and I do feel able to say this, is that if the figure of Jesus in the Gospels does not in some way correspond to an actual figure called Jesus, then it's the most extraordinary literary creation of all time. Because if you think about the requirement that you'd have to give a writer, you'd have to say, okay, we need you to portray someone who is simultaneously very human and very divine. We need you to fashion a story out of his life that will move and stir and transform and set on its head everything that the world he was born into took for granted. And this story that you tell is going to have to be one that people in 2,000 years' time and in continents that you've never even heard of are going to find powerful and moving. No one's ever managed to do that. So I guess that I would say, at the very least, he's the most remarkable literary figure, the most remarkable figure in literary history. Whether I would go beyond that, I haver on the edge of the diving board.
Thank you so much. I know people who are watching will be rushing to buy Dominion, and
well,
it's an amazing book. It's an amazing book, and written with such love and vigor and passion for history and culture, and I found it absolutely terrific. And we wish you well with your current projects.
Thank you very much.